In October of 1991, a fishing vessel, commercial fishing vessel, named the Andrea Gale, along with her 6-man crew from Gloucester, Massachusetts, were fishing in the waters of the North Atlantic, approximately 180 miles northeast of Sable Island. Unbeknownst to the crew, weather conditions were changing rapidly. A very powerful low pressure was combining with an approaching front to create what meteorologists were calling the perfect storm. Unable to make harbor, the Andrea Gale and her crew were lost at sea. Many of you may remember the movie based upon that true story, The Perfect Storm. Well, chances are you're going through a storm in your life right now. As was referred to in our prayer a few moments ago, there are some individuals who are going through the storm of grief. There are some individuals who are going through the storms brought about by the loss of a job, be it temporary or permanent. There are some individuals who are going through storms created by mental and physical illness. But whatever it may be, all of us occasionally find ourselves overcome by the waves of perplexity that sweep over our souls. And in the midst of such times, we often ask, where is God? Does He really care? Is He concerned about our well-being? Well, in Acts chapter 27 and 28, the Bible describes a storm that took place off of the coast of Asia Minor and towards the Italian peninsula. It's a storm that was fierce. The occasion was when the Apostle Paul, along with his traveling companions, were making their way towards Rome. Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, describes this storm with such accuracy that you can almost feel the rain pelting against your skin. You can almost see the flashes of lightning against the darkened sky and hear the crashes of the thunder and hear the creaking of the old timbers of that ship as it strained against the elements. Paul had been charged with inciting a riot in Jerusalem, and upon his trial, he appealed to his right as a Roman citizen to appeal his case to Caesar. And thus he was assigned to a Roman centurion by the name of Julius, who charted a passage aboard a ship. They went first to Lycia, where they changed ships, and then they sailed to a place called Fair Havens. From Fair Havens, even though weather conditions were chancy, they left and they sailed into this storm, which ultimately resulted in a shipwreck. Now, I want to share with you, if I can today, 3 important lessons that all of us can learn from the storms of life. And the first is a very powerful lesson for all of us to remember. And that is simply that God does not always calm the storm, but He does calm us in the midst of the storms. You may remember another storm that's pictured in the Bible. This one is much more familiar to us than the one in the book of Acts. It's found in Matthew chapter 8, and it involved Jesus and his disciples aboard a boat on the Sea of Galilee. As they were aboard this boat, given the location of the Sea of Galilee, located just south of a mountain range with Mount Hermon to the north, and the cold, dry air that would sweep down off the mountains over the warm, moist air rising from that body of water, a sudden and furious storm erupted. But this was more than just a summertime thunderstorm. This was a storm that involved the very elements themselves, the winds and the waves. The disciples, many of them seasoned fishermen themselves, became fearful. while Jesus slept in the bottom of the ship. And so finally, in their desperation, they cried out to Jesus with those words that are familiar to us, "Master, do you not care that we're about to perish?" Jesus arose, rebuked the disciples, "Oh, you of little faith," and then looked out over the waves and the wind, the elements, and spoke just 3 words: "Peace, be still." And suddenly the winds subsided and the sea became as calm as glass. The disciples looked at one another and said to themselves, "What manner of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey his voice." There are times in life when God does calm the storm, and we're thankful for that. But my friend, God does not always calm the storm. Sometimes He is more interested in calming us in the midst of the storm. This past week, I was watching a YouTube video of a well-known Pentecostal preacher who, in very dramatic and animated fashion, was seeking to rebuke what he called the demon of COVID-19 in the name of Jesus. And he said, "Die." He was just very animated and dramatic in the fashion in which he did this. And as I saw that, I thought to myself, would it not be better, instead of trying to tell God what to do, if instead we simply said, "Lord, your will be done. You are sovereign. Use this for whatever purposes you have intended." And it was then that it occurred to me that sometimes God uses storms in life to calm us and to help us find that anchor that keeps the soul steadfast and sure while the billows roll. I cannot assure you that COVID-19 is going to pass quickly. I cannot assure you that we as a church are going to be able to come back together next week or the next or the next. I cannot assure you that life will return to what we have thought to be normal. But I can assure you of this: we do have such an anchor. We do have one who calms us in the midst of a turbulent and stormy sea. And that's what happened with Paul and with those who were his traveling companions aboard that ship sailing for Italy. In the midst of that storm, when the ship began to be hurtled about by the winds and they were in danger of crashing upon the reefs, the sailors began doing everything in their power to save their ship. They secured the lifeboat. They threw overboard the cargo of the ship. The next day, when that didn't help, they actually took the ship's tackle and they began casting it overboard. But in the midst of all of this, according to Acts 27, verses 22 through 24, in the midst of all of this, the Apostle Paul said, "Do not be afraid, for there will be no loss of life. Only the ship will be destroyed. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid.'" My friend, I believe that's the same message God has for us today. Do not be afraid. God has always assured His people during difficult times that He would be with them. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, after the death of Moses, when Joshua assumed command of Israel, God said, "Be not dismayed. Do not be afraid, neither be dismayed, for I, the Lord your God, am with you wherever you go." The psalmist said in that beautiful 23rd Psalm Though I walk through the valley of deepest darkness, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. And thus, even though the storm may not subside, God provides a sense of calm for us. Secondly, God uses storms to bring us where He wants us to be. There's strength in the storm. One thing about a storm in life, it never leaves you exactly where it finds you. None of us ever emerges from a storm being exactly the same person that we were entering that storm. And here in the account of Acts 27, we find as Paul and his companions are sailing aboard this vessel, that God used that storm to accomplish a much broader purpose. Oh, they made a lot of mistakes. In fact, if you'll look beginning about verse 9 down through about verse 16 here in Acts chapter 27, you'll see several things that the crew did that was very wrong. Number one, they acted in a very hasty manner. While they were harboring at Fair Havens, they were anxious to make it to a port called Phoenix that was located to the southwest. And thus they acted hastily. They made a hasty decision that ended up costing them a great deal. Secondly, they ignored good advice. Paul tried to tell them that it would not be a good idea for them to sail in the midst of such precarious weather conditions. And yet, they didn't listen to Paul. Rather, they listened to the pilot and to the owner of the ship. Third, they followed the will of the majority. All of the crew said, "Let's go." And so they decided to act upon the will of the majority. They made a number of mistakes. But watch what happens. In the midst of all of these mistakes, God was in control of the overall picture. And He used that storm as a means of bringing the Apostle Paul to Rome. And it was in Rome that Paul did some of his most productive work in terms of his writing, what we call the prison epistles of Philippians and Colossians and Philemon, all written there in Rome during Paul's stay. God is able to direct the storms of your life, whatever they may be. He's able to use the mistakes of your life and to help in the broader picture to lead you where He wants you to be. God provides strength in the storm. Third, God always provides an anchor. The psalmist recognized this in Psalm 46, verse 1, when he said, "God is our refuge and strength." And notice what he says, a very present help in trouble. He doesn't say that God was a help in trouble or that God will be a help in trouble, but he says a very present, here and now help in the midst of our difficulty. He talks about natural calamity, though the mountains be moved or the waters foam. He talks about international discord, though nation rise up against nation. And finally, in verse 10 of Psalm 46, David says, be still, and know that I am God." I'm thankful that in the midst of tumultuous times, we have an anchor that cannot be moved. And that anchor is God and the assurance that He provides us, that He will never forsake us or leave us, but He will be with us always, bringing us through to a victorious end. Rodgers and Hammerstein many years ago wrote a song that contained the lyrics, "When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky and the sweet-smelling song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, Walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. My dear friend, this morning I want you to know, in spite of the storms you're encountering, you do not have to walk alone. May God bless.